Just 9 days ago, the world witnessed one of the most bizarre diplomatic episodes in modern American history. The President of the United States stood on stage in Davos, Switzerland, and announced a framework deal on Greenland that doesn't actually exist. No document, no terms, no agreement. Denmark and Greenland say they have no idea what he's talking about. NATO allies were blindsided. And what was supposed to be a masterful negotiation has devolved into an international embarrassment that's shaking the foundations of the world's most powerful military alliance. This isn't just a failed deal. This is a crisis that reveals something far more dangerous about America's standing in the world. The situation unfolding right now represents an unprecedented fracture in transatlantic relations. On January 21st, 2026, President Trump emerged from a meeting with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte in Davos and declared victory. A framework of a future deal that would give America everything it wanted in Greenland. He immediately dropped his threat to impose devastating tariffs on 8 European allies. The crisis, it seemed, was over. But here's what actually happened. Multiple sources confirm there is no deal, no written agreement. Danish and Greenlandic officials say they weren't consulted. The framework Trump celebrated? It appears to be nothing more than an agreement to keep talking about things the United States already has access to under a 1951 treaty. As Margaret Brennan explored in her Face the Nation interviews with Senator Mark Warner and Congressman Mike Turner in the days leading up to Davos, what we're witnessing isn't just failed diplomacy. It's a fundamental challenge to NATO itself, the alliance that has kept the peace in Europe for 75 years. These aren't marginal concerns from opposition voices. These are warnings from senior members of Congress who oversee intelligence and NATO relations. The numbers tell part of the story. Trump threatened $1.7 trillion in transatlantic trade. He targeted 8 NATO allies. 7 of them F-35 partners. 3 have U.S. nuclear weapons on their soil. 5 host permanent American troops. And he did all this over an island that 85% of its residents have said they do not want to be part of the United States. But to understand why this moment is so significant, why academics are calling this hybrid warfare against a NATO ally, why former CIA directors are expressing shame, we need to look at how we got here, what actually happened in Davos, and what this means for American power in a world that's watching very carefully. The Greenland crisis didn't begin in January 2026. It started building from the moment of Trump's re-election in 2024, when he made clear that his interest in acquiring Greenland, an obsession from his first term, hadn't faded. But what happened in January represented a dramatic escalation that would bring the Western alliance to the brink. On January 7th, Trump made a statement that sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles worldwide. He declared that he doesn't need international law. His exact words? "My own morality, my own mind. It's the only thing that can stop me. I don't need international law." He also suggested it might be a choice between preserving NATO or seizing Greenland. Let that sink in. The President of the United States, the leader of the most powerful member of NATO, was openly questioning whether the alliance's survival was worth more than territorial expansion. Then came Stephen Miller's wife, Katie Miller, posting a map showing Greenland covered in the American flag with the word "soon." This wasn't some fringe commentator. This was the wife of the White House Deputy Chief of Staff. The message was clear. The administration was serious. By mid-January, Denmark and several European allies had deployed troops to Greenland in Operation Arctic Endurance. More than 550 soldiers from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, and Germany. Their intent was to demonstrate solidarity and capability to defend the island. They wanted to reassure Trump that Arctic security was being taken seriously. Trump interpreted it completely differently. He saw it as European defiance. On January 17th, he issued his ultimatum. Starting February 1st, he would impose a 10% tariff on Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland. On June 1st, that tariff would jump to 25%, unless Denmark agreed to sell Greenland to the United States. The tariff threat represented approximately $1.7 trillion in trade, the entire transatlantic economic relationship. Trump wasn't just making demands, he was holding the Western economic order hostage. As Senator Mark Warner told Margaret Brennan on Face the Nation, the only security threat to Greenland right now is the United States. Think about that statement. The ranking member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, someone who sees classified intelligence daily, was saying that America had become the threat. What happened next reveals something even more critical about how this crisis exposed fractures that may never heal. The European response to Trump's threats was unprecedented in its coordination and clarity. On January 6, 2026, 7 major European leaders issued a joint statement. France's Emmanuel Macron, Germany's Friedrich Merz, Italy's Giorgia Meloni, Poland's Donald Tusk, Spain's Pedro Sanchez, the UK's Keir Starmer, and Denmark's Mette Frederiksen. Their language was unambiguous: sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the inviolability of borders. They declared that Greenland belongs to its people. It is for Denmark and Greenland, and them only, to decide on matters concerning Denmark and Greenland. This wasn't the usual diplomatic hedging. This was a clear red line. European Council President Antonio Costa went further, stating the EU would not accept violations of international law and would support Denmark and Greenland when needed. Behind closed doors, the discussions were even more stark. The European Union convened an emergency meeting on January 18th. While many wanted to pursue diplomatic solutions, some members called for implementing what they termed a bazooka package, massive retaliatory tariffs and trade restrictions against the United States. The practical problem? Such a package would take up to a year to fully implement. Europe had the will to fight back, but not the immediate tools. Meanwhile, bipartisan legislation was being drafted in the U.S. Senate. The NATO Unity Protection Act, sponsored by Lisa Murkowski and Jeanne Shaheen, would prohibit the use of federal funds to blockade, occupy, annex, conduct military operations against, or assert control over the territory of a NATO state. The fact that such legislation was even necessary tells you everything about how serious this had become. As Congressman Mike Turner told Margaret Brennan, there certainly is no authority that the president has to use military force to seize territory from a NATO country. But the immediate reactions only scratched the surface of what this crisis revealed about the changing nature of American power and alliance relationships. When Trump arrived at the World Economic Forum in Davos on January 21st, expectations were low. European leaders braced for confrontation. Instead, they got something far more confusing, a performance that left more questions than answers. Trump's speech that day was revealing in its contradictions. He falsely claimed that Greenland is a U.S. territory. He confused Iceland with Greenland multiple times. He dismissed NATO's value, suggesting only America's allies had benefited from 75 years of collective security. He extolled American power and suggested that allies' only hope was to ride on America's coattails. But then came the pivot. Trump ruled out military force to seize Greenland. The tariffs? Also off the table, for now. And after a meeting with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, Trump announced on Truth Social, "We have formed the framework of a future deal with respect to Greenland and, in fact, the entire Arctic region." The word framework is doing enormous work in that sentence, because here's what we know now, 9 days later. There is no written agreement. Multiple sources confirm that as of late January, nothing has been put to paper. Danish officials say Trump and Rutte simply agreed that Denmark and the U.S. will begin talking. Greenland's Prime Minister Jens Frederik Nielsen was blunt in his press conference the next day. "I don't know what's concrete in that deal." Denmark's Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, reiterated that while Denmark could negotiate on everything political, security, investments, economy, they cannot negotiate on our sovereignty. Even more revealing, European diplomats told reporters they were blindsided. One European diplomat stated, "Rutte negotiated this on his own. Everyone is grateful to Mark Rutte for pulling this off, but there are big question marks over what was agreed." Another diplomat was more pointed. The deal was the best way to divide us, particularly after EU countries had stood united in opposing Trump's demands. So what actually was agreed to? Based on statements from various officials, it appears to involve increased U.S. military presence in Greenland, which the 1951 Defense Agreement already allows, access to Greenland's mineral resources, which the U.S. already has the ability to negotiate commercially, installation of parts of the Golden Dome missile defense system, which again, existing agreements would permit with Danish consent, and a push for NATO to establish Arctic Sentry, a new mission to boost Arctic security. CNN's analysis was devastating. The framework sounds a lot like what the United States already had. One analyst went further, calling the entire affair one of the most erratic episodes involving a modern president on the world stage. But here's the critical question. If Trump essentially got nothing new, why did he back down? And what did this entire episode cost America in terms of credibility and alliance cohesion? To understand how extraordinary this crisis is, we need historical context. The United States has been interested in Greenland for over 150 years. Secretary of State William Seward advocated purchasing it in 1867, the same year he bought Alaska. The idea resurfaced in 1910 and again in 1946 when the U.S. secretly offered to buy the island for what would be $1.6 billion in today's money. But here's the critical difference. In every previous instance, these were quiet diplomatic inquiries. When Denmark said no, America accepted it and moved on. The relationship was preserved. The alliance remained strong. What makes Trump's approach unprecedented isn't the interest in Greenland. It's the method. Threatening military force against a NATO ally, threatening economic warfare against 8 allied nations, publicly humiliating European leaders, posting AI-generated images of raising the American flag over foreign territory, and most significantly, stating explicitly that international law doesn't matter and questioning NATO's value. As one international law scholar noted, this is the first time in modern history that a state has sought to acquire territory that explicitly is not for sale, while that territory is part of an allied nation. There are historical parallels, but they're not encouraging. When imperial powers have pursued territorial expansion over the objections of allied or friendly nations, it's typically marked the beginning of alliance breakdowns. Britain's handling of the Suez Crisis in 1956 permanently altered its relationship with the United States. The Soviet Union's invasions of Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968 shattered any remaining illusions about socialist solidarity. What we're seeing now is a powerful state using hybrid warfare tactics, coercion, economic threats, information warfare, diplomatic pressure, against its own allies. Danish researchers on hybrid warfare confirm that Trump's actions clearly amount to hybrid warfare. But history shows us that moments like these rarely unfold as expected. The question is whether the damage can be contained, or whether we're witnessing a fundamental realignment of the Western alliance. The geopolitical ramifications of this crisis extend far beyond Greenland itself. At the strategic level, this episode has handed Russia and China an extraordinary gift. Moscow has watched gleefully as the NATO alliance tears itself apart from within. Russian state media has amplified every moment of the crisis, using it to argue that Western unity is a myth and that American leadership is unpredictable and self-serving. When the leader of NATO openly threatens other NATO members, Why should anyone trust collective defense commitments? China's response has been more subtle but equally significant. Beijing has deepened its engagement with European nations who are suddenly questioning their relationship with Washington. The trade deal Canada signed with China in the midst of this crisis, that's a direct consequence of Trump's behavior. As Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney put it, there's been a rupture in the rules-based international order, and the United States is the primary cause. In the Arctic specifically, this crisis has accelerated a competition that was already intensifying. Russia has been militarizing its northern coast for years. China, despite being nowhere near the Arctic Circle, has declared itself a near-Arctic state and has been pursuing research and commercial access throughout the region. The bitter irony? Trump's stated justification for wanting Greenland is to prevent Chinese and Russian influence. But his methods have made European allies less willing to coordinate with Washington on Arctic security. As one European official noted, closeness and dependency, as in the past, is not coming back. The crisis has also exposed the vulnerability of the US-EU economic relationship. The threat to $1.7 trillion in trade wasn't just economic leverage. It was revealing how much mutual dependence exists. Europe has been forced to contemplate what a post-American security architecture might look like. Those discussions aren't theoretical anymore. Military implications are equally significant. Denmark has announced a $13.7 billion investment in Arctic capabilities. Germany has proposed the Arctic Sentry mission within NATO. Finland and Sweden's recent NATO membership has transformed the strategic map of the High North. All of this was happening anyway, but Trump's threats have accelerated the timeline and added urgency to ensuring these capabilities aren't solely dependent on American participation. Consider the GI-UK gap, the Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom maritime choke point that's been critical to Western defense since World War II. Control of this region allows monitoring of Russian submarine movements from their northern bases into the Atlantic. It's one of the most strategically valuable pieces of maritime geography on Earth. The United States already has access to bases that monitor this gap. The 1951 Defense Agreement gives extensive rights, but Trump's demand for ownership suggests he doesn't trust alliance structures to guarantee access. That mistrust is now mutual. Perhaps most devastating is the message this sends to adversaries about American commitments. If the United States will threaten its closest allies over territorial demands, what does that say about its willingness to defend those allies from actual threats? Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, the Collective Defense Clause that states an attack on one is an attack on all, relies on trust. That trust has been severely damaged. And the domestic ramifications are just beginning to emerge. The political earthquake this crisis has triggered within the United States reveals deep fissures in how America views its role in the world. Congressional response has been fractured along predictable but concerning lines. Democrats have been almost uniformly critical. Senator Mark Warner's statement to Margaret Brennan captured the sentiment. The only country that's frankly benefiting the most from this chaos are both Russia and China. But Republican response has been more complex and more telling. Publicly, most Republican lawmakers have remained quiet or offered tepid support for the administration. Privately, it's a different story. As Warner noted, Republican colleagues have told him quietly, "Mark, this is crazy," but won't say it publicly. The few Republicans who have spoken out have been stark in their assessment. Congressman Mike Turner, head of the U.S. delegation to NATO's Parliamentary Assembly, told Margaret Brennan that Trump's approach is not art of the deal, and that threatening NATO puts at risk Trump's own foreign policy goals regarding Gaza and Ukraine. The bipartisan NATO Unity Protection Act represents an extraordinary development. Congress trying to legally constrain a president from taking military action against an ally. The fact that such legislation is necessary reveals how deep the concern runs. The implications for the 2026 midterms are already becoming clear. Democrats are using the Greenland crisis as evidence of chaotic foreign policy that weakens American security. Polling conducted by Face the Nation showed wide bipartisan opposition to using military force to take Greenland, with disapproval even for the idea of purchasing the island. But more significantly, the crisis has exposed what many feared, that Trump's approach to foreign policy is fundamentally transactional in ways that traditional alliance structures can't accommodate. When the president says he doesn't need international law and questions whether NATO is worth preserving, that's not a negotiating tactic. That's a worldview. The business community response has been muted but nervous. The tariff threats against Europe represented potential disruption to hundreds of billions in trade relationships. While those threats were paused, the precedent has been set. If the president will weaponize trade policy over territorial demands that don't directly involve the United States, what other demands might follow? Intelligence community concerns have been expressed, carefully but clearly. Former CIA Director John Brennan called it outrageous that we are threatening Denmark and spoke of a sense of shame among Americans over Trump's international behavior. Current intelligence officials have been more circumspect, but Senator Warner, with access to classified briefings, has been explicit. There is no current security threat to Greenland from Russia or China that justifies the president's demands. The only threat to Greenland right now is American. Legal scholars have raised constitutional questions about the president's authority to use military force against an ally, to threaten territorial annexation, and to impose tariffs as leverage for non-economic goals. These questions may soon be tested in courts if the administration pursues its Greenland ambitions further. And the question of what happens next in Washington depends entirely on whether Trump views the Davos framework as victory or merely a tactical pause. One of the administration's primary justifications for pursuing Greenland has been access to rare earth minerals and natural resources. The reality is far more complex and far less compelling than the rhetoric suggests. Greenland does indeed sit atop significant mineral deposits. Rare earth elements, uranium, iron ore, gold, rubies, and potentially oil and gas reserves. On paper, it looks like a resource bonanza, but reality intrudes in important ways. As of January 2026, Greenland has exactly 2 active mines. One is a gold mine still being commissioned. The other, owned by Lumina Sustainable Materials, mines a northesite. A ruby mine went bankrupt and closed in 2024. That's it. That's the extent of Greenland's current mineral production. The CEO of Lumina described his company's operations as more complex than any of the 270 other sites he'd overseen globally. He stated bluntly, investing in Greenland is not for the faint of heart. Why? Because every mining project in Greenland is greenfield, starting from scratch. There's virtually no infrastructure. Every mine requires building new roads, new ports, new power plants, all in one of the harshest climates on Earth. About 80% of Greenland is covered by an ice sheet up to 3 kilometers thick. The economic reality is even more sobering. As Bloomberg's Javier Blas noted, hyperbole around Greenland and commodities has a 50-year-long history. Greenland has never produced any petroleum. The attempt to mine iron ore ended in bankruptcy. As of 2023, the United States imported only $190 million in rare earth elements total. If prices rose significantly, those materials could be obtained more easily and cheaply from American deposits or from other sources than from Greenland's undeveloped mines. Blas urged American policymakers to focus on the African Copper Belt and other established mining regions as far more important to securing resource supplies. The idea that controlling Greenland would solve America's rare earth dependency is, in his analysis, largely fantasy. Even if the resources could be economically extracted, there's a legal complexity. As Greenland's Minister for Mineral Resources, Naja Nathanielsen, explained to Euronews, Greenland cannot give the United States exclusive access to minerals. As a rules-based country, that would violate international trade law. Nathanielsen was clear about Greenland's position. I do not want to combine any form of defense agreement with access to our minerals. Defense cooperation is one track. Economic cooperation is another. They should remain separate. The Trump administration's emphasis on minerals also reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of how resource extraction works in the 21st century. You don't need to own territory to access its resources. You need investment capital, technical expertise, infrastructure, and commercial agreements. The United States already has the ability to pursue all of these in Greenland through normal channels. The mineral justification appears to be more about political narrative than economic or strategic reality. But it plays well domestically, the idea of securing critical resources for American industry. What this reveals is that the real drivers of Trump's Greenland obsession may have less to do with actual strategic necessity and more to do with something else entirely. How different media ecosystems have covered the Greenland crisis reveals as much about our fractured information landscape as it does about the crisis itself. American right-wing media largely framed Trump's demands as bold leadership. The emphasis was on America's right to pursue its security interests and on the strategic importance of Arctic control. The threats against allies were downplayed or justified as necessary pressure tactics. Mainstream American outlets focused more on the diplomatic chaos and the damage to alliance relationships. Analysts like Margaret Brennan highlighted the contradiction between Trump's stated goals and his methods. The emphasis was on expert opinion, questioning both the necessity and the effectiveness of Trump's approach. European media coverage was far more unified in its criticism. From Der Spiegel in Germany to Le Monde in France to The Guardian in the UK, the framing was consistent. America had become an unpredictable and potentially dangerous ally. The coverage emphasized European unity in response and Denmark's courage in standing firm. Danish and Greenlandic media reflected a mix of anger, bewilderment, and determination. The notion that their territory could be subject to American demands was treated as a violation of fundamental principles of sovereignty and self-determination. Russian and Chinese state media predictably amplified the crisis as evidence of Western hypocrisy and American imperialism. RT and Sputnik ran numerous stories highlighting European criticisms of Trump. Chinese outlets emphasized the contrast between American demands and China's stated respect for sovereignty. Social media dynamics were particularly revealing. On platforms like X, Trump's supporters rallied around nationalist messaging and America First framing. Critics highlighted the damage to alliances and the departure from American values. European users expressed shock and anger at American behavior. The disinformation angle is also significant. False claims circulated widely that Greenland's defense consisted of only 2 dog sleds. Trump himself spread this. That Denmark wasn't adequately defending the island. That China was on the verge of establishing military bases in Greenland. None of these claims withstood scrutiny, but they shaped public perception. What's clear is that there's no longer a shared narrative space where Americans and Europeans understand events through similar frameworks. The Greenland crisis means fundamentally different things to different audiences, based on their information sources. This fragmentation makes diplomatic resolution harder because domestic audiences in both America and Europe are receiving such different accounts of what's happening and why it matters. So where does this go from here? The framework announced in Davos leaves almost everything unresolved. Let's examine the most likely scenarios. In this scenario, the working group established between the US, Denmark, and Greenland actually produces a substantive agreement. It would likely involve expanded US military presence in Greenland, which the 1951 agreement already allows, but perhaps with more specific infrastructure commitments. NATO's Arctic Sentry mission gets established, giving the alliance a permanent presence, similar to Baltic air policing. Denmark continues its $13.7 billion Arctic investment. The U.S. gets enhanced access and capabilities. Denmark retains sovereignty. Greenland's views are respected. Everyone claims victory. The probability? Moderate. This outcome requires Trump to accept that he's not getting ownership and to frame expanded access as winning. It requires European allies to trust American commitments despite what just happened. It requires Greenland to accept increased militarization. All possible, but requiring significant diplomatic skill and good faith. Trump views the Davos framework as a temporary tactical retreat and renews his demands within months. Perhaps he points to lack of progress in negotiations as justification for returning to threats. The tariffs come back. European unity fractures under sustained pressure. In this scenario, we see a fundamental crisis in NATO. Article 5 credibility collapses. European nations accelerate plans for autonomous defense capabilities separate from the alliance. The US-EU economic relationship fragments. Russia and China expand influence in the resulting vacuum. The probability? Lower, but not negligible. It depends largely on whether Trump becomes convinced that the Greenland issue is no longer politically useful for him domestically, or whether he returns to it as a grievance and rallying point. This is the muddle-through option. Negotiations continue through the working group, but produce little concrete beyond what already exists. Both sides claim progress. Nothing fundamental changes. Trump periodically raises Greenland in speeches and on social media, keeping the issue alive, but without the intensity of January 2026. European allies remain wary but functional. The relationship between the U.S. and Europe remains strained but workable. Concrete changes happen on the margins. Perhaps a few infrastructure improvements at U.S. facilities in Greenland. Maybe some enhanced intelligence sharing on Arctic threats. Possibly some coordination on preventing Chinese investment. But the core issue? Trump's desire for American ownership versus Denmark and Greenland's insistence on sovereignty remains unresolved. It sits there as a latent fault line that could reactivate at any moment. The probability? Highest. This is the path of least resistance. Neither side gets what it really wants, but neither side forces a decisive break. What tips the scenario one way or another? Several factors. Trump's domestic political needs. If he needs the Greenland issue to rally his base before the 2026 midterms, expect escalation. If he's focused on other priorities, expect drift. European unity. If the EU can maintain solidarity, it strengthens their negotiating position. If divisions emerge, Trump will exploit them. Greenland's independence timeline. If Greenland accelerates its move toward independence from Denmark, it changes the entire calculus. An independent Greenland would have full sovereignty to make its own decisions about American presence. Russian or Chinese actions. If either power makes aggressive moves in the Arctic, it could bring the U.S. and Europe back together around shared security concerns. Congressional action. If the NATO Unity Protection Act passes, it constrains presidential options. If it doesn't, Trump has more freedom of action. But perhaps the most critical question is what this entire episode reveals about the deeper patterns at work. The Greenland crisis isn't an isolated incident. It's the latest and most dramatic example of a broader pattern that's been building throughout Trump's second term. We saw it with the intervention in Venezuela in early January 2026, when 20% of the U.S. fleet was deployed without congressional consultation. We see it in the administration's questioning of Federal Reserve independence. We see it in the treatment of international agreements as purely transactional arrangements subject to unilateral American revision. What connects all these episodes is a fundamental departure from the post-World War II American approach to international order. For 80 years, the United States has positioned itself as the guarantor of a rules-based system. American power was exercised through institutions, alliances, and norms that constrained everyone, including America itself. The bargain was clear. America would accept some limits on its freedom of action in exchange for a system that magnified American influence and created a stable environment for American prosperity and security. Trump's approach rejects that entire framework. The view is that American power is constrained rather than amplified by alliances, that international law and norms are obstacles rather than tools, that bilateral deals based on power differentials are preferable to multilateral institutions based on rules. This isn't just a different strategy, it's a different conception of what American power is and how it should be exercised. The Greenland crisis crystallizes this divide. Traditional national security establishment figures, people like former NATO ambassador R. Nicholas Burns, former CIA director John Brennan, congressional leaders like Mike Turner and Mark Warner, all see Trump's approach as dangerous and self-defeating. But Trump and his advisors see it differently. They believe previous administrations have been naive, that allies have taken advantage of American generosity, and that only by demonstrating willingness to disrupt the system can America get what it needs. Who's right? The Greenland crisis suggests the Trump theory isn't working as intended. America didn't get Greenland or any new access it didn't already have. What it got was damaged relationships, questioned credibility, and empowered adversaries. As one Carnegie Endowment analysis noted, the episode matters because it crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. The most powerful member of NATO openly challenged the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and political agency of another. Even if this particular crisis fades, that line has been crossed. European allies now know that American territorial demands backed by economic threats are within the realm of possibility. That knowledge changes everything about how they plan, how they invest, and how they think about their relationship with Washington. The pattern we're seeing, aggressive demands on allies, threats of force or economic coercion, dismissal of international norms, transactional approach to relationships. This isn't producing American victories, it's producing American isolation. Canada, America's closest ally with the world's longest shared border, signed a major trade deal with China in the midst of this crisis. That's not a coincidence, that's a consequence. So what does all of this mean? Let's synthesize the key implications that will shape American foreign policy and global security for years to come. First, NATO's credibility is fundamentally damaged. The episode has revealed that the United States, under certain leadership, is willing to threaten and coerce its own allies. That knowledge cannot be unlearned. European nations are already accelerating plans for autonomous defense capabilities. The NATO Article 5 guarantee that an attack on one is an attack on all relies on trust. When the most powerful member openly questions the alliance's value and threatens other members, that trust erodes. As one European professor of international relations stated bluntly, closeness and dependency, as in the past, is not coming back. Second, this marks a decisive moment in the post-World War II international order. For 80 years, American leadership of the Western Alliance was predicated on predictability, institutional frameworks, and mutual respect among allies. That model has been shattered. Even if a future administration tries to restore traditional approaches, allies will always remember that America is capable of this behavior. The system has been shown to be fragile in ways that weren't apparent before. Third, the winners from this crisis are clear: Russia and China. Moscow couldn't have designed a better outcome if it had planned it. The NATO alliance tearing itself apart from within, American credibility questioned, European unity tested, Chinese influence expanding as countries look for alternatives to American partnership. The strategic gift this hands to American adversaries is incalculable. Fourth, the episode exposes deep problems with how American power is understood and exercised. As Margaret Brennan and her guests explored, threatening Denmark doesn't make America safer or more secure. The United States already had everything it needed in Greenland through the 1951 Defense Agreement. What the U.S. didn't have, and still doesn't have, is the trust and willing cooperation of allies who feel respected rather than coerced. Fifth, the failure of the deal is itself significant. Trump positioned himself as the master deal maker. The Greenland episode demonstrates that his transactional approach doesn't work when dealing with nations that have their own democratic accountability, public opinion, and principles. You can't bully democracies the way you might pressure a business counterpart. Denmark and Greenland stood firm despite enormous pressure, and Trump had to back down. Sixth, this creates a template for future crises. We now know that this administration is willing to threaten major economic disruption over demands that even senior Republicans acknowledge the president has no authority to pursue. The Greenland crisis may be paused, but the method remains available. What other demands might follow this pattern? Canada? The Panama Canal? Other territories Trump views as strategically important. Seventh, domestic political accountability is failing. Congressional Republicans, with few exceptions, have been unwilling to publicly constrain presidential behavior, even when they privately acknowledge it's problematic. The checks and balances that are supposed to prevent executive overreach aren't functioning as designed. This emboldens further escalation. Eighth, the information warfare dimension matters. The fact that such different narratives exist in different media ecosystems means there's no shared understanding of events. Trump supporters genuinely believe he's defending American interests. European publics genuinely believe America has become a threat. These aren't just different interpretations, they're different realities. Resolving diplomatic crises requires shared understanding. That's become nearly impossible. The bottom line is this: Washington has embarrassed itself on the world stage in ways that will have lasting consequences. The so-called framework deal announced in Davos was an exercise in face-saving that fooled no one. Denmark and Greenland retained their sovereignty and their dignity. America got nothing it didn't already have and lost something far more valuable: the trust and respect of its closest allies. And this is far from over. The working group continues. Negotiations proceed. But the fundamental contradiction remains unresolved. Trump wants what Denmark and Greenland will not give. No amount of pressure has changed that equation. The crisis may have been paused, but the tensions that created it remain. The world is watching. Adversaries are taking notes. Allies are making plans that don't depend on American reliability. And the liberal international order that America built and led for 80 years is fracturing in ways that may prove irreparable. As one European diplomat stated, expressing both relief and concern about the Davos agreement, this was the best way to divide us. That's what's been accomplished. Not a deal, not enhanced security, but division, distrust, and doubt about whether America remains the partner that Europe thought it knew. The Greenland crisis is a symptom of a deeper transformation in how America engages with the world. And if this is the new normal, constant crises with allies, transactional coercion replacing principled partnership, threats instead of diplomacy, then the damage we've seen is just the beginning. If you're following these developments and want clear, fact-driven analysis without hype, this is where we're committed to bringing you that perspective. The Greenland crisis isn't just a story about an island in the Arctic. It's about fundamental questions of how power is exercised, how alliances function, and what American leadership means in the 21st century. This is a developing situation and will continue providing in-depth coverage as new information emerges. The working group between the United States, Denmark, and Greenland continues its discussions. NATO is developing its response. Congressional oversight efforts are ongoing, and the broader implications for the transatlantic relationship are still unfolding. I want to hear from you in the comments. What do you think the long-term consequences of this crisis will be? Can NATO survive as an effective alliance after this episode? Should the United States have this kind of territorial ambition toward allied nations? How do you think this will affect America's relationships with other countries? And specifically, having watched Margaret Brennan's interviews with Senator Warner and Congressman Turner, do you think Congress will actually provide a check on presidential power in foreign affairs? Or have we moved beyond that model of governance? The stakes here extend far beyond Greenland itself. This is about the kind of world we're going to live in for the next generation. An order based on rules and institutions, or one based purely on power and coercion. Partners and allies working together, or great powers pursuing their interests without constraint. Subscribe for continued coverage and expert analysis as this situation develops. We'll be bringing you updates as the working group progresses, as NATO makes decisions about Arctic security, and as the political fallout continues both in the United States and in Europe. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our follow-up analysis on what comes next in this unprecedented crisis in transatlantic relations. The Greenland crisis has pulled back the curtain on the future of American power and alliance politics. What we've learned isn't comforting, but it's essential to understand. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.